There we go. So we can start, I think. Hi, everybody. Thanks to everyone that wanted to join today and is with us for this extremely important conversation on the rights of women, trans women, and non-binary persons in Pakistan. My name is Amelina, and I am working with Global Human Rights Defense, and I'm coordinating the team for Pakistan, where we report on human rights violations against minority groups by the government or third parties. And during my time in GHRD, it just kept on coming up, also during my time as an intern, just this constant violence against gender minorities in general that is just very prevalent, very sadly, in Pakistan. And as an outsider, because I am not originating from Pakistan, I felt like I needed to give some space to some people that have been working on this very important issue to discuss the nuance that comes with working in the field. Yeah, so this is what you guys are attending today. It's this panel, this conversation that we have with our two lovely panelists, Moneeza and Sara. And I just want to introduce to you as well, Sana, who is one of our volunteers in Team Pakistan, and she single-handedly connected us with these lovely panelists and has helped so much in the panel itself. And the panel could not have been done without her. So me and Sana will be co-moderating this conversation and this panel, which will be more conversational to get an insight of Moneeza and Sara's lives in the field of the rights of gender minorities. And I would not want to take this opportunity away from our panelists to introduce themselves, because I believe they will do it much better than I will, knowing all of these years of hard work that they have put in the struggle for gender equality. And so I would like to start this conversation by asking both of you to tell us a little bit about yourselves, your background, your nationality, your career, education, whatever you think that may be relevant for us to know. And I would like to give the floor to Moneeza to start.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much, Emelina and Sana, and for taking out the time, and also just in terms of all the labor and hard work that you put towards this panel. And it's great to speak, it's great to sort of speak with other feminists and activists, and also kind of, have these conversations and get perspectives. So thank you so much, for organizing and for the opportunity. So yeah, what about me? I'm basically from Karachi, and I moved back. I was in Toronto for about 9 years, mostly in my teens and when I was in my 20s. And basically, I moved back in about 16 years ago, and I started doing social development work. So basically, again, in the social development sector, doing a lot more sort of disaster relief work. But that's sort of also where my interest emerged in working with communities. But what I also did was started doing activism, but I kind of kept the work and activism separately or separate. I'll talk about why I think we, in Pakistan, that's been an interesting strategy for us, even for the feminist movement, and particularly the march that we do. So yes, within activism, I was part of the lawyers movement, which was ages ago now, in 2007, and I worked for the fishermen community. And initially, we worked with sort of all genders, but I would say in the last 5 years or so, I have focused more on working with women, and and then working with other gender minorities, that's trans women and non-binary folks as well. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me, and I think my interest in sort of this work comes from a long time ago, sort of my own personal history and my own personal story as well. So yeah.
Yes, thank you for this great introduction. Sara, Could you also give us an introduction?
Sure, and like Mon said, thank you, Emelina, and thank you, Sana, for organizing this. It's great to be in conversation with you, and it's great to be in conversation with Moneeza also. Um, so, yeah, so I, like Moneeza, grew up in Karachi, and I was born here, and I went to school here, and until I was 18. And then I moved to the US, and I was there for several years because I went to college there and I went to law school there as well. And I think, my decision to eventually go to law school and become a lawyer was, I kind of made that choice more or less while I was in Pakistan, while I was a young student here. And I think, there were a couple of influences, but definitely one influence was seeing, very prominent women rights activists in Pakistan who were also lawyers doing a lot of really good work during the 90s and the 2000s when I grew up for women's rights and trying to attain, equality for women under the law. So I did grow up around that, and I think that kind of influenced my decision to go to law school and then want to practice human rights law in some capacity. And then after I studied law in the US, I worked there for a couple of years, focusing on labor and employment law, and representing primarily labor unions. So I worked with teacher unions and port worker unions over there, which was also, a really good experience because I got to learn a little bit about labor organizing and movement building a little bit, to the extent that you kind of have to know these things if you're representing labor unions and giving them legal counsel. And then I moved back to Pakistan, and decided that I want to practice law here. And I spent the first few years working at a law firm that did a range of legal work, and their focus wasn't on human rights or public interest related work, but I started to take on human rights cases on the side. And I also started to work with an international human rights organization called Center for Reproductive Rights that works to advance reproductive rights of women around the globe. And they also wanted to do some work in Pakistan around women's access to maternal health services, and how we can get better legal guarantees for women, especially women from poor and marginalized backgrounds who don't have access to, obstetric care services or access to contraception or safe abortion services. So I started doing some work around that, and also started taking on cases of domestic violence and gender-based violence. And that kind of continues to be my practice to this day. And yeah, and then in the process, also working with Karachi based collectives and groups, and it was kind of really not not I mean, for me, I think to this day I'm not formally a part of any of the many collectives that we have, but do interact with them. And it was just during this process that I mean, I'd known Moneeza for a while, and other activists for a while also, and just really through conversations, the idea of the march came up, and then it just kind of took off from there. So yeah, so that's a bit of a background.
Thank you so much. So, and because I'm also a Karachi-based activist, so I think I will ask you, Moneeza and Sara, a few more targeted questions regarding, so we can start with talking about the march itself, because the first march in Pakistan took place in 2018, and you both are also the organizers that started it. So in terms of organizing around women's rights in Pakistan, what do you feel are the biggest obstacles that stand in the way? And how would you compare that with perhaps other experiences that you've had abroad? So for example, in the US and Canada. So how do you think it compares?
Mons, you want to take it
Okay,
first?
should I go first? Okay. Okay. So firstly, I want to say that in terms of sort of the idea of the Aurat March, it was actually Sara who contacted a few of us and said, we should just do this. And, you know, and a lot of people, we were kind of thinking about it, like over the years, especially with the US Women's March. But just in terms of initiating and taking direct actions, I really want to give that shout out to Sara, because if she hadn't called that first meeting, I don't know if it would have happened, and sort of the resulting, or maybe, you know, who knows, maybe sort of subsequently. And I also want to say that that was also around the time that Sara was getting married. So it was amazing. It was amazing to, you know, to Sara, I don't know if you wanted me to announce that or not, but I just thought I'd slip that in, because I was like, wow, this, you know, and I think it, you know, it was crazy for you that year, but the fact that you organized it still was amazing. So I think, you know, in terms of organizing in Pakistan, I think there's a lot of different kind of obstacles, right? So I think one thing is that, you know, when you start sort of organizing, whether that's in communities and marginalized communities, or we do a lot of sort of social media outreach. And that's also something really new to us before the march, because I think the political work that everybody was doing was also, you know, was kind of in pockets. People were working with, you know, with different marginalized groups of people, but sort of unifying and, you know, giving sort of the feminist voice, you know, a larger voice was something new. And I think social media played a huge role in that, because we really used that to especially reach out to urban women and younger urban women. So I think one thing that I definitely think is when you start to go into communities and you organize women, and just even like in the beginning, it was just to come to the march, right, and to talk about you know, what was the march about and the issues that they could bring forth within the march. I think we face a lot of resistance within those communities, and particularly women who come from those communities, you know, face resistance into attending the march, into coming out. I think that there is a culture of women in protesting in Pakistan, but it is not as wide as perhaps you know, some of the other countries, even in our region. So I think, you know, the first year it was, I think that was sort of something new, right? It's just that in terms of organizing people to come out, to raise their voice, to march, and to be part of sort of a political force, right? And then subsequently, what has happened is that because, you know, the march has sort of shaken up and brought out a lot of these, lot of issues perhaps which weren't being talked about before, which is, you know, sexuality, you know, choice, you know, sort of talking about the body, right? And so subsequently what has happened in different marches is that there's a lot of resistance that we face when we go into communities through the rest of the year. And the resistance isn't from women, but a lot of people around those women, right? So a lot of our organizers who are in these communities actually face a lot of backlash from their families, from men in their neighborhoods, you know, sort of really harassing them and calling them all sorts of names. So I think that sort of still remains to be, you know, a challenge. I think the other thing that's really, you know, in terms of organizing is the social media backlash, because, and I think that's something which we always, like everybody expects, right, who does this kind of work. But the thing is that you know, the threats on social media that the organizers have gotten, generally sort of, you know, I think the first march, I think there was this sign which said, you know, "Khana khud garam karo," which basically translates into, you know, warm up your own food, right? Sort of questioning this sort of male entitlement that happens in our families. And I think like even that, right, which wasn't so much about sexuality or the body, which sort of came a little later, it sort of got so much backlash. And the thing is, politically, of course, it shakes it up, right? It shakes up the system and it has that intended impact. But sometimes it actually attracts a lot more people into the Aurat March, and so the conversations get started. But of course, sort of organizing within communities, there's difficulty in that. But I think I also want to say that I think the political climate, right? So when we started the march, we had to be, as you guys might already know, we talked about this in sort of previous conversations, that the sort of the establishment or the government, and then we have a lot of sort of influence by the military. They have had a long history of shunning movements in Pakistan, picking people up. There's a long history of sort of coming after activists, trying to disrupt movements. And I think, so we knew that even while we're organizing, even today, we knew that that's sort of in the larger landscape of sort of, we have to, we can't call out certain, for example, elements in our society, but of course we have to continue to sort of watch out, right? And then of course there's the resistance that comes from the religious right, within Pakistan. And I think these are all sort of factors that play a role. And so often we do go into communities, right? And we do get sort of fear from the women, right? And mostly marginalized communities saying things like, no, we're not allowed to go. This is like Western, or there's a lot of sort of misinformation around this as well. And so I think, but I also think, with that said, this is also movement building. I think the kind of context that we're in, the political climate that we're in, I think that if we were not getting any resistance, happen. But also, we're shaking things up. We're trying to create a dent in a really long patriarchal sort of traditional structure. And we also think the state structure is quite patriarchal. So, this is part of it as well, I feel. And how it compares to Canada, I think, is in Canada, I think that it's different because, of course, organizing is hard everywhere, right? But I think that the state is more conducive to listening. And I was in Toronto, Ontario, and while I was there, we had the Liberal government, which is sort of centered to the left government. And so, we organized around getting a tuition freeze in university. We got that. So I'm just saying that you perhaps get more successes because the government is more open to listening, the society is a bit more open. And I know that's not necessarily always how it is in the US, and I think Canada is, I would say, much nicer in that way. And Canadians are, I would like to say, much nicer and open to listening. There's more diversity and it's not to say that there aren't issues that exist over there around discrimination, around racism, around labor. But I have found that basically, it's easier, I would say, to organize in that landscape.
Okay, thank you, Moneeza. Sara?
Yeah, so, I think I also want to add the point that, yes, I think, as you mentioned, Sana, 2018 was the first march. But I think, Moneeza is talking about the initial idea conversations that we had, and that for me, when I'd reached out to Moneeza and a couple of other people and talked about organizing it, I wasn't anticipating that as many people would show up in the first march. I remember, Moneeza, I mean, when we had our first conversations about it, we were literally like, I mean, if 500 people show up, we thought it would be a success. And we were actually thought that, maybe realistically only a couple of hundred people would show up, because I think, we should, because in the protests that we were participating in that would happen around that time, and a lot of them would kind of be, I mean, not exactly spontaneous, but they wouldn't be, they would be organized over a short period of time, and they would maybe be around certain events or issues that had come up, like some people had gone missing, journalists, bloggers had gone missing, or something that they were around specific issues, and we wouldn't get large turnouts typically at all. And so we weren't expecting a lot of people, a lot of women to come. But I think Moneeza, really kind of put her heart and soul into getting people together. And the idea, it was a very deliberate effort to reach out to as many different and diverse groups that are fighting, not just, I think, for women's rights, but also human rights in general. And so a range of stakeholders, I think, were reached out to, which is why in the first march alone, I think the turnout was more than what I had anticipated. And so I think that's really that was a lot of hard work on the ground, and Moneeza was I think a real a leader in that. So it wouldn't have been possible without that effort. But I think all the obstacles that Moneeza mentioned, I completely want to reinforce those. I think that with organizing women in Pakistan, it's because it's such a conservative environment for most women that to the idea of women occupying public spaces is still very much a taboo. And it's not just, I mean, it's to the point where we know that it's actually dangerous for women to break social norms and venture out, because the rates of violence against women in Pakistan are so high. And so in this environment, for women to, and it's not the case, I mean, even women who are very well aware, or, they know, they want to venture out, they know what their rights are, it's still very, very difficult. For them to occupy public spaces. And so I think that's a huge challenge. And even if with the marches, I think for a few years now, women, have been coming out in numbers, but I think making something, having, enabling them to come out on a more consistent or regular basis is remains a challenge. So yeah, sure, they can come out once a year, a couple of years, but can they do something more frequently? Or for women from many of from different socioeconomic backgrounds or certain ethnic backgrounds, to then actually become regularly involved in collectives, be part of meetings in those collectives, and then organize, different things in between marches, is very, very difficult, because they just have so many cultural obstacles and so many constraints at home to be able to do that. And I think that's a big challenge. And then obviously that combined with an environment, a state environment that is also repressive. In the last Aurat march, there was quite a lot of backlash. And even though it wasn't, maybe directly coming from state actors, there was, good reason to believe that there was some support of it from state actors. And I think in some cities, like I think in Islamabad, even basic permits were not given to the organizers, and that was a challenge also. So that constraint is definitely there. The fear of backlash is also definitely there. And so I think that makes it makes it difficult. And I think even the turnouts that have happened in the marches, I think that's pretty exceptional. I think that's something to be proud of. But I think the challenge then is, how do you make that into something more regular? And how do you get women from diverse backgrounds to then take the lead in determining agendas and being part of the organizing movement?
Thank you. So kind of following from what both Sara and Moneeza you said, since you guys have spoken about there being the turnout being remarkable, but there being so many difficulties, and of course, the more that the march happens each year, the difficulties sort of increase and the risk increases as well. So I would want to know, what is your opinion about how the march effectively contributes to the feminist movement within Pakistan? Do you think that it is an effective platform to voice concerns? Do you think that there could be other avenues that could also be taken? Or what are the ways that you feel like the march should be complemented as well? So for example, both of you also do a lot of follow-up work after the march finishes. So how do you feel like the march has evolved from 2018 to now, and how effective do you feel it is as a platform to voice concerns?
Should I go first, Sara, or? Yeah, or? Okay. Okay, so I think the march has definitely evolved. What I would say is that the impact of the march, and I think this is it's really interesting because it took us a couple of years to understand this as well internally amongst the organizers, that a lot of the feminist work that was done sort of pre-2018 was quite focused on the state, right? So there's a group called the Women's Action Forum that has really been instrumental in changing really regressive laws, working within institutions to improve the, sort of everything from judges' attitudes to working with the police, and that has been really instrumental in sort of keeping the conversation go forward and really making institutions more aware about what is happening, particularly around issues of violence, right? Like Sara mentioned, there's a high incidence of violence within our country. But I think the one thing that, that Aurat March did, and this is something that we've seen over the years, that, there's a lot of younger people who get attached to it, who are, attracted by it, who have sort of, just in terms of participation, brought, for example, a lot of the demands, which then have been sort of popularized in our society, But I think that, and we've always, there are a lot of people within our organizing committee who believe also that, that Aurat March should be more focused towards sort of, working within institutions, and we do that, right? Like, we have our demands, and, we want institutional change. So we want, better laws, we want, and this is sort of, we're more intersectional. So we ask for a higher minimum wage, but we also ask for example, better laws, more medical legal officers, for example, so medical legal officer is the person who examines anybody who has gone through violence, right? So from the police side. So, but what we have seen within the Aurat March is that a lot of the younger feminists or younger women, and of course it's not just women, but non-binary folk, trans folk, or gender identities, they are not so focused on, on sort of demanding things from the state. And I think the reason for that also is that generally what we have seen over the last 20 years in Pakistan, that the urban populations are quite apathetic from the political process, right? So we don't have a lot of sort of urban younger people, particularly women, who join political parties. Yes, there's some who do, but generally they, a lot of them don't vote, they don't follow politics, they don't follow mainstream politics. And so Aurat March then became more about politicizing, right? Politicizing women, politicizing, sort of the non-binary folk. They found themselves sort of, with a platform that they could voice out their opinion. And then we saw that there were a lot of sort of other collectives which were formed. There are a lot of people who were part of the organizing from Aurat March who are now organizing on other platforms, on land rights, on minority rights. There's sort of queer political groups which have been formed. And so I think this was the impact really, it's sort of at different levels, but I think one big impact is around politicization. And then also, I really believe this, that there's also a confidence, right? That if we actually organize, we can come out on the street, show political force, because, for me, the Aurat March is about politicization and showing that this is actually an issue and showing your political power on the street. There's a lot of things that, and I think that's generally also what the global marches did, right? And at least from the outside, that's how I saw the impact, right? That, for example, the first US Women's March after Trump got elected really brought the question of choice and of women's rights, and in front of a president that didn't care that much. And so that's sort of, we want to show basically that we're a force to be reckoned with. And I think that's what the march does. It shakes it up, and it's seen now as sort of a face of the feminist movement in Pakistan, right? To the media and to, to sort of the general public. How long we would do this, the march, we're not sure. Maybe the next year, a couple more. And what we're looking to do now is to sort of, and it's just something that we've done from the beginning, is trying to organize more, feminist collectives that work throughout the year. I'm part of a feminist collective that, we go into sort of different marginalized communities. We want, making sort of smaller groups where, women can talk about their issues. They can organize within their communities, whether that's at the home level, whether that's within their neighborhood. And so I think that I've always seen the march as sort of a spark, or, something that, launches other political work. Whereas, of course, you cannot reduce the significance of the day itself. But I think it has a real rippling effect on other things that are happening. And now what we're also seeing is more and more people want to do politics. They want to get into doing political work. They want to, and so one thing that we're looking at doing is perhaps forming a political party, maybe the next year, but we're also looking at running a few candidates, progressive candidates on, in sort of the upcoming elections in about 18 months or so. So, and I do think that's because of the march, because I think the march has been a triggering force, and and people starting to think, okay, well, this is an issue. I can get into politics. I can change. I can create change. So yeah, and yeah, there are other sort of changes too, but I think I've gone on for enough. So I'll give Sara a chance to speak.
Yeah, so I think one of the, I think Moneeza talked about how the march was a spark. And I think that that's a good way to describe, I think, what one of the main intentions was behind organizing this, because prior to that, even though women marches have been happening in some countries in the world, and the Me Too movement has started in many parts of the world, but in Pakistan, we didn't really see a trigger of that conversation, right? We didn't see that kind of, in a sense, like this revival of the women's movement, a very loud revival of the women's movement that we were seeing in other parts of the world. But at the same time, we were seeing incidents of violence being reported in the media. And, we also just in our conversations with each other, there was a lot of frustration about the levels of misogyny in society that we felt people were not talking about. And I think the purpose of the Aurat March was to show that there is a large number of women who are unhappy with the status quo and who want to challenge the patriarchy, because we weren't having any loud proclamation of that for people to really sit up and take notice. And the Aurat marches have done that, I think. They've managed to bring together women who made their voices heard, and people have listened, and many of them have been very angry at what they've heard. But I think that was one of the goals. If people were not being angry and if there was no backlash, then there probably wouldn't be a point of the march, right? But the fact that there was, I think, showed that the march was really hitting a nerve and pointing to some real tensions in societies. So I think that in that sense, the march definitely accomplished that. It influenced the conversation. And for weeks and weeks after the Aurat March, we know that like the Twitter trends and conversations on Facebook are often, even like influencers on YouTube and so on, they're talking about slogans raised at Aurat March, and banners at Aurat March. So it's definitely igniting a conversation, which was one of the goals of it. And definitely, especially young people who have been participating in the Aurat March, I think that they are taking that message back to their spheres. And it might not be in ways that are, very coherent or very well documented. But I know, for example, that in universities and higher educational institutions, students who are attending the marches have gone back and they've tried to do things to make their universities better places for women, to change certain policies or to have harassment policies implemented. And I think that the Aurat March, that space where they came together with other women, saw so many women coming together and talking about the same things, really sparked them to do that. So I think in that sense, these are, and to me at least, this was in many ways the point of the Aurat March. And a march in itself, obviously we know that to actually bring about the structural reforms that we need to deal with patriarchy, that's not going to happen through one event, but that's obviously going to happen through a lot of sustained work, a lot of sustained organizing, a lot of sustained, making agendas, driving agendas, identifying those in power that we can reach out to. I mean, that's all the movement building work, and a march is a part of that. And I think it's become a very important part of that for the last few years in Pakistan. But I think all people who are involved in it know that it's not sufficient, it's not meant to be sufficient. And but to the extent that it was meant to affect the conversation, influence the conversation, and ignite things, I think it's definitely done that. And I think another concrete thing is around in September 2020, a woman was raped on a motorway close to a large city in Pakistan, in Lahore, and she was gang raped. And there was a lot of rapid mobilization that happened right after that. There were protests across cities, and quite a large number of people attended the protests. The media covered it intensively for a few days. And I think that that mobilization probably couldn't have happened, I think, had we not had the Aurat marches for, I think, 2 or 3 years, I think, before that. So we're seeing mobilizations also happen during the course of the year, and I think the Aurat march is providing a base for that. But I think, of course, the question of the systemic reform that we need, that's going to require more than protests, marches, and so on. So I think that's the ongoing work that we all have to do.
Yeah, thank you so much for the insightful responses. And about that idea for the political party, good luck. We're all here for it. I wish
Thank
you all the
you.
best. And I mean, the Aurat March is one of the most important things for all the reasons you just stated, for all the ripple effects that it has, for just the potential that it gives to women to come together and mobilize. And I just wanted to ask you, I know we've covered a lot of that, but I wanted to ask you about um, other aspects of your work in gender minority rights. So, because we heard a lot of your background in passing when you did your own introductions, and I personally heard a lot of interesting stories that I would like for you to say, but I would like you to pick one now to tell us one important story or case or piece of your work that you feel is either representative of what it's like to work in this field in Pakistan, or it would be maybe your favorite case. Just the freedom is yours to pick. I just believe that we would all benefit from hearing some of your stories.
So, Sara, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think it's hard to pick one, but yeah, I think, well, okay, so I can talk about a case that I did where I represent. So this case was initiated before the first Aurat March, where I represented a young woman who was facing, repeated domestic violence from her husband, and it was a couple of women rights activists who referred the case to me, and they knew this young woman because her mother was employed by one of them. And it's kind of special because eventually, we tried the case. It was the first case to be tried under a domestic violence law that had been passed in the province many years ago, but it had not been activated because, one of the what we were talking about, the systemic issues that we face in Pakistan is that, even laws that have been passed to address gender-based violence, and quite a few have been passed over the last 15 years or so, are just not being properly implemented. And so this was the first domestic violence case that we brought in court, and after a trial that lasted for 2 years, and it required a lot of perseverance on the part of the survivor, and then also, on the part of the activists who brought the case to me and who provided her all the kind of moral support that she needed to see that case through. And we finally got a conviction. And I guess, that case is important to me also because the survivor then came to the second Aurat March, I think. Yeah, and she came carrying her banners. So that was special. Yeah.
Oh, that's so nice. I didn't know that.
That's so
But she
lovely.
came. That's so great.
She
Yeah.
did. Yeah, she did.
Very heartwarming. Thank you
Yeah.
for this. How about you, Moneeza? Did you come up with your story?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of stories. I would say since the Aurat March, I have definitely been more focused on sort of building around sort of doing more feminist political work. I think one thing that we're kind of currently focusing on within our collective is, well, there are two issues that we're focusing on right now. One is forced conversions. So what happens here is that a lot of the minorities that exist here, religious minorities, a lot of the times the younger girls are often taken by force or kind of groomed by a lot of the older men, and kind of and immediately there's a marriage performed after conversion of that girl, and usually it's always under 18. Majority of it is that she's a minor, and then because they have sort of this religious what do you call it, validation of her having converted, often, you know, the girl is sort of completely cut away from the family. And so this is something that we call sort of forced conversion, just in terms of summary. So we're working on that through the March. Actually, we have huge outreach into minorities. So we're taking some of that work forward. In terms of stories, I think that there are a lot. I think one thing which was really interesting for me just a couple of weeks ago, that one of the communities that we outreach to for the March, they had their land is sort of being occupied by some land developers. So we had that meeting at 10:30 p.m. at night in a church, because again, that community is mostly minorities. And yeah, it was like packed with 200 people, mostly women. And it was, and I loved that it was at 10:30 at night. Because, you know, that's actually what political organizing happens at, you know, at sort of very, you know, unstructured places, unstructured times, over tea, over, you know, many other things like that. So I don't know if that's like a interesting story, but I definitely got goosebumps from that meeting. And yeah, I think we're also working on trans rights. We formed a committee with a trans organization here. And we're going to take up cases on the Khwaja community, which is sort of the indigenous trans community here in Pakistan. So, and also India, sort of in the region. So I don't know if that's a very exciting story, but I think that what has been really interesting in terms of this work is also the friendships and the feminist relationships that have emerged, you know, and it's also being friends with a lot of diverse people. And of course, there's also been conflict. But, you know, and because also this march happens in many cities, about 5 other cities now as well. And so, yeah, of course there is. But at the same time, it's been great to sort of build that solidarity and, you know, develop those relationships. But I think that's definitely one, like one of the best parts of it.
Thank you. That was very nice. So like moving forward from what you guys have already said, so you both highlighted some of the obstacles that you have to face when you're fighting for gendered rights in the country. So kind of keeping this in mind, what reforms do you envision, or what resources are kind of needed to move the country in a more positive trajectory? And you know, how can the situation of women's rights or gender's rights in Pakistan improve, according to you?
Sara, because this is such a long, it would be such a long answer.
Yes, yeah. But yeah, just in case, like where, because I know that you both work in sort of with different platforms as well and different resources. So in your experience.
Yeah. I think one thing I would definitely say is that, you know, definitely more the state to be more oriented towards, you know, towards rights of women and other gender minorities. Like, it's right now we have a federal government which is completely up. It's actually anti-women. You know, I call them anti-women political party. That's the sort of the ruling federal party. So I think the fact that it needs to be on the national agenda, and I think for that we need to do a lot more sort of organizing on the ground, you know, building sort of more of a political force, because I think that's the only way, you know, we have seen that governments actually do pay attention, or at least that's what, you know, our experience has been on this. I think the other thing is that more people need to come into politics. I think that's really also key, because we live in a really sort of oppressed conservative environment. And I think that, you know, the kind of change that Sara was talking about, right? That, you know, throughout the year, you need sustained effort. You need, you know, consistent, sustained effort to get things through. And even with that, you don't always necessarily win, right? And so I think really building, you know, more on the ground, and, you know, building sort of political organizations of feminists as well as, more people entering politics and eventually, winning seats, getting into the government, because it's, that's sort of the only way to go. But I also feel that, sort of societal change will continue to happen. So the feminist thought or the feminist movement is in direct conflict, I would say, with sort of this conservative religious right. And that's really moving in a really fast pace, at a fast pace. And so, sort of just to counter that, or to create space for this kind of thought or society or this kind of work, is actually the first step, which I think that the march has been successful in doing, like Sara was also saying, right? So I think to continue to do more of that, because yes, the ideal would be to have a feminist party in office, and also to have a stronger democracy, for example. But I think that's like a 20-year goal from where we're at right now. And it's an amazing 20-year goal, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that a lot of, what we need to achieve equal rights for women is really, a lot of it overlaps with what we need to generally realize human rights in Pakistan for a whole range of marginalized groups, right? So we need to have states that are, meeting their human rights obligations, that consider themselves to be accountable to the people, that are, democratic in a much truer sense, and for whom, upliftment of poor people is a real goal, because that is going to help to lift a lot of women, and that's going to help to ensure that, to help to ensure that the government is responsive to these demands that are being made, because they care what people think. So a lot of, I think a lot of the reform and change that we need is going to happen if the demands of progressive movements across the board are realized. And so we do need to build, I think, these coalitions, because there are lots of different, pressure groups, movements in Pakistan that are focusing on, many different specific issues, right? There's no dearth of human rights issues in Pakistan, but they're not necessarily coming together. They're not necessarily forming coalitions. I mean, there are different pushes towards that, but I think that's still, pretty siloed. So I think that, there's more work to be done to bring progressive voices together around common goals. And I think that that's certainly going to be a way forward. And I think a lot of the progressive movements, their goal, one of their central goal, especially now, given the political reality that we have, which is that we don't have effectively a democratic government. It's just democratic on paper. A lot of our constitution, we have a democratic constitution that guarantees a lot of human rights, but we know that that's not been implemented in spirit. We have what's often been called as a hybrid regime, because we have this one huge pressure group that's really in control of this country. And so strengthening civilian democracy is, I think, something that's important is a priority for a lot of progressive movements. And I think it has to be a priority for women's movements as well, because I don't think in a context, in an environment like Pakistan, in the absence of democratic civilian government, I think there's very little that we're going to be able to attain. So I think from the state perspective, from the political perspective, I think that's what needs to be done. And then from a movement perspective, we I think do need to, I think that the women's movements or the movements right now are also similarly I think divided in the sense that, you know, I think Aurat March is a great place where you see many different groups coming together, but then we kind of splinter off and do our own thing, right? So there are many women groups that are mobilizing quite, you know, and sometimes quite successfully, right? So for example, we have a lady health workers. It's a large cadre of women health practitioners who provide very basic health services to women and children, and they've mobilized very effectively in Pakistan to improve their working conditions. Then, you know, you have women who we see mobilize quite, you know, really powerfully around enforced disappearances in their communities. In a lot of communities, you see it's women who are coming out and demonstrating. And so, you know, you do have all these different pockets of women mobilizing, and sometimes, you know, many of them are coming together for a march, and then we're all going off and doing our own thing a lot of the times. And of course, efforts are being made to bring them together, but for a whole lot of reasons, they don't. And that's not a recent thing. I think historically in Pakistan, the women's movement has not been able to bring together the many different ways in which women do mobilize in Pakistan. So I think that's something that we still have to try and do. I think it is a lot of hard work, but as Moneeza said, that's what organizing is. It is a lot of hard work. So yeah, so I think, yeah, the work is cut out for us.
Yeah, understandable. Thank you both for your answers. And now I would like to ask you a more holistic question, because we've been talking about so many important things, and I know I feel like so much information is there and I need to absorb it, but I would like for each of you to tell me, what do you think that the people watching right now need to remember? They absolutely need to remember about the struggle for women's rights and gender rights in Pakistan and for other gender minorities. Because we have talked about everything, a lot of things about that you're doing, but tell me the most important thing in your opinion, the one thing they need to take out of this.
Well, okay, so I would say that for people who are who are sort of associated with South Asia, Pakistan would be you know, to be good allies, right? To support whatever sort of feminist political action might be happening, whether that is the march or other action. But I would also say that for people who are not sort of not in Pakistan, I would say that I think support gender rights within your own sort of neighborhoods, countries, and yeah, be allies, I would say, as much as possible, and get involved. I would say get involved, even if it's because I think that the one thing around, and I think this is something that actually also the Aurat March has taught me, is that not everybody is going to organize all the time 24/7, right? There will be some people who might give more time than others. But the reality is that whatever you can do, sort of as an individual or being part of a collective, I think would be a really great contribution.
Thank you, Moneeza. Is everything okay with the camera and everything?
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
No,
I
don't
think
worry.
we just. Is it fine now? Can you guys see me?
Yeah, we can see you. I
Okay.
didn't know if it was
Okay,
your
I think I had
connection.
clicked it stop video by mistake. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. And what about you, Sarah? What do you have to suggest?
Yeah, so I think that's what Moneeza said. I think that's really good advice for people who, you know, who want to organize and who would be interested in organize. I mean, I think it's very important to get involved, as Mon said. I think what I was thinking, there's a quote that there is this really well-known women's rights activist from Pakistan who passed away recently, Asma Jahangir. I think she's one of the most prominent women rights activists and lawyers. And there's a quote from her that I think really applies to the situation of women in Pakistan. I think once she said that for women in Pakistan, democracy is a question of survival. And we do live in an environment where where women are are killed every day. We see reports of women being killed every day. It's literally a place where if in many parts of Pakistan it's dangerous for a woman to I mean, exercising her autonomy can still to this day be fatal for a woman. And I think Asma Jahangi was right when she said that in our context, it's really only a democratic politics and democratic system of governance that can build those institutions in state and society that can make it safer and more conducive for women to be able to exercise their autonomy and live as free citizens. And democracy doesn't only mean that you have an election every 5 years and the party that wins runs. I mean, it means that the whole range of human rights and freedoms are available, or at least they're close to being made available with as few constraints as possible. And I think it's really only then that women can think about living as equal citizens in Pakistan. So I think the struggle for democracy and the struggle for women's rights in Pakistan has to go together. So that's just one very, 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 very broad thing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sara and Moneeza. So I think I'm going to just ask the last question, and then we can open it up to anyone else in the audience that perhaps wants to ask a question. So now that we're also, like, you guys spoke a lot about how younger feminists are being involved within the feminist movement, which is very important, but they're bringing up issues such as sexuality, about bodily autonomy. And how do you feel that ideas around this are being accepted or sort of spoken about in society, and how are they being incorporated within the feminist movement itself? Do you think that there needs to be more work that needs to be done, or do you think there are too many hindrances that stand in the way? Yeah. Also, again, sorry, I just very loaded questions, which I know.
No, this is good. This is, yeah, no, that's fine. This is great questions. So I think issues around bodily autonomy and sexual autonomy and sexual choice, I think that's something that has created, like, that Aurat March, I would say from the second Aurat March, it has really brought on those questions into the mainstream. And I think that it has, and I think that's one of the reasons there's also so much backlash, at least we analyze. This is one big reason, right? Because what's happening also is that Aurat March is cross-class, right? So a lot of the conversations around sort of bodily autonomy, sexual choice, sexuality are happening perhaps in sort of higher class circles, or more sort of middle class circles, or university students, but again, those that studying perhaps in private universities. Sort of in the larger, sort of more working class communities, it's not that those issues are not there. Of course they are, but they are not so openly talked about. And the reason they're not so openly talked about, and of course there are some communities which are better than others on certain issues, certain working class communities, but these are things which are not talked about freely. So we had the slogan in 2019. Well, since 2018, it's called. It's actually from the 60s in the US. My body, my choice. Right, and so it was translated into Urdu, and it sort of became one of the slogans of Aurat March. And and I love that slogan because it actually encompasses sexuality, bodily choice, autonomy, and that sentence really created, like that slogan really created sort of enormous backlash. But what it also did is start a conversation. And we saw a lot of people talking about it, the media talking about it, particularly after the march. So I do think that these ideas are being more openly talked about. And like I said, I think I would say from before the Aurat march, I don't think that sort of, again, more students, more younger queer people were involved as much in political organizing, perhaps a little bit. But I think Aurat march has really given that platform to them. The thing is that it's going to be, the way I see it, that we will always do that kind of work. We will always, introduce ideas of sort of queer sexuality, but it'll look different. It'll look different than what it does, I think, globally. For example, the language looks different. So, so Pakistan has a long history of indigenous Khwajah movement, which is, Khwajah community, which has been there for what, 2,000 years now? Or what, well, not 2,000 years, sorry, 1,000 years, they say, right, in this region. And so, for example, they say that, don't use the word queer for us. Don't use the word trans for us, because, we're our own community. We use the word Khwajah for us. And so this is really interesting, right? Because it's also post-colonial, right? Like this kind of resistance, it's sort of more decolonizing yourself in that way. Like they see it like that. And so I think it would look different, and I think we're also trying to figure it out, because it's, I see this, the newer, younger feminist movement is like a baby movement, right? It's only been 3 or 4 years, and so it's, of course, there's resistance. Like I said, anytime we go out and organize on feminist rights, there will be resistance. But I think that even with the backlash, we're trying to, figure out ways to continue to organize around this. But I will say that it will look different, and it will look different in different areas of our society. So the way that sort of more younger people talk about it, the language they use, the ideas of, for example, sexuality and gender identity. And it is, of course, influenced to a certain degree by what's happening globally, and there's nothing wrong with that. So it's not a critique at all, but it's also that in different sections of society that conversations are happening very differently. And so, Aurat March being more of a coalition, is perhaps has to take all of that into account. And it's messy. It's messy. There's a lot of discussions, anger that happens, but we're also figuring out and moving forward, right? So I think Aurat March as a whole the way I see it at least, will always be committed, to doing that work. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Highly important. And Sara?
I think just one thing I want to say about that is that I think that in many different communities and across different classes, the way in which, especially young girls are thinking about their sexuality, well, not just young girls, but I think young boys also, young men, adolescents, are thinking about sexuality, exploring their sexuality, I think is changing very rapidly. And I think it's still something that we, even we in the women's movement and the feminist movement, I think maybe haven't yet fully grasped, because I think the changes are so rapid. And I mean, I'm just basing this really on, my kind of, this is my, my experiences, and this is very anecdotal, just based on, really, for me, it's really based on the cases that come before me and the kind of help that I think young people need legally. But it seems to me that, you know, that young people, you know, teenagers from across classes in Pakistan, even in very conservative contexts, are exploring their sexuality, are curious about their sexuality. We don't have data in Pakistan, unfortunately, but we know that around the world, the age of sexual debut, for example, is decreasing. And to me, it seems it's definitely also decreasing in Pakistan. And while there's a huge taboo around extramarital sex, how much of that is actually constraining choices that are being made by young people when they can make them is a different question.
Yeah.
I think among young people, demand for sexual and reproductive health services is on the rise, but the supply is not there, especially if they're from low-income backgrounds. They don't have access to proper counseling and information, and you know that leads to a whole host of other complications. And you know, this is, I mean, we're all observing this, that this is happening, but because it's not being well documented and we don't have good data, I think even as, you know, as activists and as a movement, we're not fully ready to aware and ready to grasp and kind of know what to do. And especially for people from low income backgrounds and women from the more marginalized and conservative backgrounds, I think that there is a lot of need and desire and complications that are arising from this. I think, and technology and social media is playing a big role in all of this also, in terms of how much access people have to, you know, get around the constraints of their conservative communities. So they're able to, and they're doing that, but that's also leading to a lot of complications, a lot of tensions. So I think these are real issues that I think we do have to address, but even we probably don't have, you know, our finger on it quite yet.
Yeah, thank you very much. Understandable. It's a very complex issue, and especially with the constraints that you were talking about before, it must be very overly complicated. But now I would like to open the floor to the audience that is with us and ask if there would be any questions for our panelists directly from you, the
And thank
viewers.
you. I think it's been 1 hour, 15 minutes. So the people who stuck till the end, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can either write it in the chat or feel free to ask the question with your mic on. Either or is very acceptable. Let's see. So one question we got is, what does the face of equality look like in Pakistan in the future? Very interesting. Would any of you like to take this?
Okay. Let me, I think, no, let me take it. Yeah. I think,
Perfect.
yeah, I think that it really depends on how much into the future you're asking. But I would say that I think for me, equality really looks like, you know, or at least in Pakistan also, it would really look like sort of autonomy, you know, for all genders, you know, a much more sort of, you know, egalitarian economic system, sort of stronger democracy. But I would say that in society, sort of the indicators would be the first big one would be that, you know, that we see a huge change in the violence that is happening in our society, because I think that would be a real indicator for equality for me here. You know, more sort of more women out in the streets, working, getting educated, you know, and I would say a real sort of more distribution of wealth, you know, and a stronger government, like a stronger democratic government, which is actually committed to this committed to equality, right? To equity and equality. And I feel like it has to be, I would say, I would say that without sort of a real radical change in the system, I don't think that we can get real equality. And again, I don't know if that's going to happen in sort of the current environment. I think it'll take a long time and a real radical shift, in sort of the political climate.
Thank you. Very, very true. Sarah, would you like to add anything?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think that covers it. Yeah.
Don't worry. We have another question. All of our, like Sana and myself and the audience.
Yeah.
Oh my God, is my connection off?
So I think,
Okay.
no.
I was
We can hear
asking,
you.
I was saying
So I
that,
think the next,
okay. So, can I, no? Let's see. So I was gonna say that both myself and Sana and the audience have been asking loaded questions. Now I'm not sure if it's mine or Sana's connection, but I'm sure something happened here. But let's move on to our next question, which is, how fair are the courts in Pakistan in access to justice?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's there are lots of barriers in access to justice, especially for women, minorities, people from low income backgrounds. I think our court system is not very efficient, and people who don't have resources to get very, very good legal representation often tend to get the short end of the stick. So yeah, so we do need a lot of reform of our judicial system in Pakistan, definitely.
Thank you. And while you're at it, we have another question for you about the justice system. And it reads, there are a number of initiatives such as the Feminist Justice Program that are seeking to rewrite judgments from a feminist perspective. What do you think is the relevance and importance of such initiatives? And what else would you like to see?
Yeah, I'm aware of the Feminist Justice Project, and I think it's very interesting. I think it's really important to get law students. I think they're taking the lead on this, or at least like professors are working with law students, as well as practitioners and academics, to look back at certain decisions, important decisions that have been made by courts in Pakistan that could have been more gender sensitive. It gets a very important, much needed conversation going on how we can improve jurisprudence. And then obviously that in a sense opens a door to better jurisprudence, right? So it opens a door to better legal arguments being made before judges that could lead to better jurisprudence. So I think it's a really important initiative. And in terms of what else I would like to see is, I would like to see more feminist academics in law schools, in law universities, and even generally, I think that there are some really excellent feminist academics in Pakistan, and they've produced really good work. And but I think we do need more, and it would be great to have more scholarship, more academic, and more academic work and more research on these issues.
Yeah, that's certainly true for most countries. I think more feminism in academia is always needed. And yeah, thank you for your perspective. I think it is now time to wrap up our lovely conversation on the rights of women and gender minorities today. And I wanted to thank, first and foremost, our lovely panelists for thank you for agreeing to coming and speaking with us about this just very, very important topic. I think speaking for some people that live, at least in Europe, I can say that myself, I did not grow up with any thoughts or any actual hearing of any of these issues that are so prominent in everyday life in Pakistan. And I feel like working in human rights, of course, I was interested, but I believe that everyone should hear about this struggle, not only to understand what we have, but what we're striving for. And thank you for being here and just giving us your perspective, your firsthand information and your stories, and for giving us your time. And thank you to the rest of the audience for staying with us once again throughout this hour and almost and a half of talking about this very loaded issue.
And of course, there's just always more to talk about when it comes to this, but because of the limitations, maybe another time. Yeah.
Maybe another time. But yeah, and thank you to Sana as well for helping me with this panel. And I wanted to give the floor to you as well right now.
Yeah, but I just wanted to say thank you so much. And I think this is a very, very loaded issue. This is a very broad issue. And thank you for concisely summarizing everything. And I think the work that you do, both do, is incredible in its own capacity. So thank you for all the work that you do personally and professionally.
Thank you so much. No, thank you.
Thank you for organizing this. It was really great to see you.
Of course.
Thank you.
And hopefully we will be able to upload this on our YouTube for people to rewatch or for you to share it with people that were otherwise occupied.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
Great.
All right.
Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.